Most people think changing your life starts with a big decision, a new job, a new routine, a new year, a new plan, but it doesn't. Because if the way you think doesn't change, nothing else really does. You can wake up earlier, work harder, even chase bigger goals. But if you're still driven by the same fears, the same doubts, the same invisible habits, you don't get a new life. You just get a faster version of the same one. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Challenge doesn't begin with action. It begins with awareness. The moment you stop asking, what do I need to do? And start asking, why am I living like this? Because the life you're living right now is not just happening to you. It is being shaped by you, by your choices, your patterns, your silence, your acceptance of things you know deep down you want to change. And the hardest part? Most people are not asleep. They are awake, but still not changing. So the real question isn't how to wake up. It's what you do the moment you finally decide you can't keep living the same way anymore. Most people believe they are awake because their eyes open every morning, because they go through routines, because they respond to the demands of life. But waking up to your reality has nothing to do with the physical act of getting out of bed. It has everything to do with whether you are aware of the life you are actually living or the life you are pretending is enough. And this is where most people remain stuck. Not because they don't want change, but because they have never truly paused long enough to see what needs to change. They confuse motion with progress. They confuse distraction with purpose. And slowly, without noticing, they build a life that feels full on the surface but empty underneath. Waking up to your reality means refusing to look away from the truth of your current life. It means observing your habits without justification. It means seeing your decisions without excuses. And it means asking yourself whether the direction you are moving in is something you consciously chose or something you simply fell into over time. Most people avoid this moment because truth requires responsibility. Once you see your reality clearly, you can no longer fully blame circumstances, people, or timing. You begin to recognize patterns. The pattern of delaying what matters. The pattern of choosing comfort over growth. The pattern of repeating the same cycles while expecting a different outcome. And that is uncomfortable because the mind prefers illusion over clarity when clarity demands change. It is easier to believe that life is happening to you than to accept that life is being shaped by you. But the moment you start observing your reality without distortion, something begins to shift internally. You begin to notice the gap between where you are and where you know you could be. Not in a way that creates pressure, but in a way that creates awareness. Awareness that your current habits are not accidental. Awareness that your current results are not random. They are the direct reflection of repeated choices. And waking up to that truth is not about judgment. It is about recognition. Because only when you recognize where you truly are can you begin to move intentionally toward where you want to be. Without that recognition, you are simply moving, not evolving. Most people mistake awareness for negativity, but awareness is actually the beginning of control. If you cannot see your patterns, you cannot change them. If you cannot see your habits, you cannot direct them. And so waking up becomes less about criticism and more about clarity. And clarity changes everything. It changes how you see your time, how you see your energy, how you see your priorities. It forces you to confront the reality that not everything you are doing is aligned with where you want to go, and not every distraction deserves your attention. Waking up to your reality is not a single moment of realization. It is a continuous process of choosing honesty over avoidance. It is the willingness to look at your life without filters, without excuses, without the comfort of denial, even when what you see is uncomfortable. And in that discomfort lies the beginning of change. Not because discomfort is pleasant, but because it reveals truth. And truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. It becomes the foundation on which every future decision is built, whether you choose to ignore it or act upon it. But most people never reach that point because they retreat the moment discomfort appears. They return to distraction, to comfort, to routine, convincing themselves that they will change later. And later becomes a cycle that repeats itself without interruption until awareness turns into regret. And the truth is, nothing changes until you decide to stop escaping your reality and start engaging with it. Not occasionally, not when it feels right, but consistently. Because the life you are living is not defined by what you know, but by what you are willing to face. And as you begin to face it, you notice subtle changes in how you respond, think, and act each day. You pause before repeating old patterns, and you start questioning reactions that once felt automatic. These shifts may seem small, but they are powerful because they show awareness becoming active instead of passive. And the more you stay with this awareness, the more you begin to see patterns you never questioned before. You start noticing what you ignored, what you avoided, and what has been shaping your life quietly over time. And in that awareness, you stand at the edge of something new that you have not fully stepped into, yet something that requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to continue forward even when the next step is not fully visible, yet taking full ownership of your life is the moment everything stops being a reaction and starts becoming a choice. Until this shift happens, most people live as if their life is something happening around them, not something being shaped by them. They see themselves as passengers, influenced by circumstances, affected by people, and moved by events they feel they have little control over. And from that mindset, life always feels slightly out of reach, slightly unfair, slightly dependent on something external changing. First ownership begins when you stop separating your life into what is in your control and what is not your fault. Because while it is true that you cannot control everything that happens to you, you are always responsible for what you do next. That space between what happens and how you respond is where your entire life is shaped. Most people underestimate that space, but everything meaningful in life exists inside it. When you take ownership, you stop asking why things happen to you in a way that keeps you stuck in the past. Instead, you start asking what you are going to do now that it has happened. This is not about ignoring pain or pretending challenges don't matter. It is about refusing to let those challenges define your direction indefinitely. A life without ownership is filled with blame. Blame toward timing, blame toward people, blame toward circumstances, even blame toward yourself in a way that becomes paralyzing instead of productive. And while blame might feel justified in the moment, it quietly removes your ability to act. Because as long as something else is responsible for your situation, you are not required to change it. But the truth is, ownership is not about guilt. It is about power. It is the recognition that if your actions contribute to your current reality, then your actions also hold the key to your future reality. That realization can feel heavy at first, but it is actually the most freeing truth you can accept. Once you fully own your life, excuses begin to lose their influence. Not because excuses disappear, but because you stop giving them authority. You begin to see them for what they are, ways the mind protects you from discomfort, from risk, from effort. And while they may feel convincing in the moment, they always lead you back to the same place you are trying to leave ownership, also changes the way you see failure. Instead of seeing failure as proof that something outside you is wrong, you begin to see it as information. Something that tells you what needs to be adjusted, what needs to be learned, what needs to be improved. This shift turns setbacks into feedback instead of final judgments, and this is where personal growth becomes real. Not when life becomes easier, but when your response to difficulty becomes stronger. When you stop waiting for conditions to improve and start improving your ability to respond under any condition. Taking ownership also means being honest about your participation in your current situation. Not in a way that ignores external factors, but in a way that refuses to hide behind them. It means acknowledging where you have avoided responsibility, where you have delayed decisions, where you have chosen comfort over action. This honesty can be uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of helplessness. And for many people, helplessness feels safer than responsibility because it removes pressure. But it also removes possibility. Because you cannot change what you refuse to own when you start living from ownership. Your language begins to change. You stop saying things like, I can't because bas, and start asking, how can I? You stop waiting for permission and start creating options. You stop defining your situation by limitations and start defining it by possibilities. And slowly, this shift builds momentum. Because every time you take responsibility for a small decision, you strengthen your ability to take responsibility for bigger ones. Every time you choose action over avoidance, you reinforce a new identity. The identity of someone who does not wait for life to change before changing themselves. Ownership also changes how you relate to time. You begin to realize that waiting is not neutral. It is a decision. And every moment spent waiting is a moment you could have used to move forward in some small way. This awareness makes you more intentional, not rushed, but aware that time is always moving regardless of your readiness. There is also a deeper shift that happens when you take full ownership. You begin to trust yourself more, not because everything becomes easy, but because you prove to yourself repeatedly that you are capable of responding, adapting, and continuing even when things are difficult. And that trust becomes the foundation for confidence that is not dependent on outcomes. It becomes the quiet understanding that no matter what happens externally, you are not powerless internally. You are not waiting for life to give you direction. You are actively shaping it through your choices, your actions, and your willingness to stay responsible, even when it would be easier. Not to breaking. The cycle of excuses is not about eliminating words from your vocabulary. It is about changing the relationship you have with your own comfort, because excuses are rarely about logic. They are about protection. They protect you from discomfort, from uncertainty, from the possibility of failure, and sometimes even from the responsibility of success. And over time, they become so automatic that you don't even recognize them as excuses anymore. They start to feel like reasons. Most people don't realize how quickly excuses take over their thinking. They begin subtly, as small justifications. I'll start tomorrow. I'm not ready yet. I don't have the right resources. Now is not the right time. On their own, these thoughts feel harmless, even reasonable. But when they become a pattern, they quietly shape a life that is defined more by delay than direction. The cycle of excuses is powerful because it always gives you temporary relief. It removes pressure in the moment. It allows you to avoid discomfort without feeling like you are making a wrong decision. But that relief comes at a cost, because every time you choose an excuse over action, You reinforce the identity of someone who delays, avoids, and hesitates, and that identity becomes self-sustaining. The more you repeat it, the more natural it feels. Eventually, you stop questioning whether you should act and start questioning whether you are even capable. Excuses shift from external justifications to internal beliefs. Breaking this cycle starts with awareness. You begin to notice the exact moments when excuses appear. Not just the obvious ones, but the subtle ones that disguise themselves as logic or timing. You start to recognize when your mind is negotiating with your potential, trying to find a comfortable alternative to action. And in those moments, there is always a choice. You can follow the excuse, or you can challenge it. Not with motivation, not with emotion, but with a simple decision to act anyway, even if it is imperfect, even if it is uncomfortable, even if it is not ideal. This is where change begins, not in eliminating excuses completely, but in refusing to obey them, because excuses only have power when you listen to them. When you treat them as instructions instead of thoughts, most people wait for excuses to disappear before they act. But excuses don't disappear on their own. They only lose strength when they are repeatedly ignored, when action becomes stronger than hesitation, when behavior starts to override thought patterns. Breaking the cycle also means understanding that excuses often hide fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of not being good enough, fear of uncertainty. And instead of confronting that fear directly, the mind creates explanations that sound logical enough to justify staying still. But fear does not go away by avoiding it. It weakens when you move through it. Every time you act despite fear, you reduce its control over you. Every time you choose effort over avoidance, you expand your capacity to handle discomfort. There is also an important shift that happens when you stop relying on excuses. You start to see results differently. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, you begin to work with what you have. Instead of focusing on limitations, you start focusing on possibilities within constraints, and this shift builds momentum. Because action creates clarity. Clarity creates confidence, and confidence reduces the need for excuses. It becomes a cycle in the opposite direction, where movement replaces hesitation. Breaking excuses also requires honesty about how much control you actually have. Not over everything,